are 5 of our lady rock climbers and Noel Brown walking along the shores of the upper lake in Glendalough. First comes Nuala Carey and Betty Healy. Next, Mona Monaghan and Noel Brown. And bringing up the rear, Kathleen Price and Susan Johnson. Looking back at the lake from the head of the valley, Betty and Nuala wait for the others to catch up. Sean Rotheray and Tom Cullen arrive first. Followed by Frank Winder and Frank Butler. Frank Winder strips for action. 3 of our members had been on an all-night walk. And here is Peter Kenny looking very fresh and active, even though he'd had no sleep. And Leonie Lehan in the yellow jumper had also been walking all night, but that didn't stop her making very good time to Camaldere. The great twin buttresses rise sheer above this place where we are resting. And now I'll hand over to Frank Winder to describe one of the climbs, Prelude.
Prelude is a hard rear climb on the scimitar face. The first pitch is not in view, so we start with the second pitch. Having made a few initial moves up a slab, Sean moves onto a small foothold in the bulge. From there, a very long reach up has to be made to get a couple of finger holds to do the very strenuous pull-up which follows. This is the crux of the climb. An exceedingly difficult move for a short man, but quite hard severe even for a tall man. Although in size Sean is a borderline case, he does it with quite astounding ease and aplomb. This is followed by a succession of further hard finger pulls, just when one's fingers are getting very tired. From then on, easier but delicately delightful climbing on smallish holds up the face follows in very exposed situations. There are larger holds near the top, but are slightly unsound and require care. The stance and belay are now arrived at, where this climb crosses scimitar, onto which one can change at this stage if one wishes for something rather harder than the next pitch of Prelude.
Well, Sean belays himself, and far away down below at the foot of the climb in a moment, you'll see Frank Winder himself starting this second pitch.
This climb is much harder for a man as short as myself than it's graded. It's probably BS. For example, for the very hard pull-up, he can only get the first joints of the fingers of one hand in the hold to make the pull-up. For a man any shorter than myself, it must be very near the limits of the possible. The only thing worthy of comment here, I think, is the method of carrying the hammer thrown over the shoulder. It's less in the way there than carried anywhere else, and is immediately accessible in case of need.
Well, Frank, climbing in his usual easy and effortless manner, joins Sean at the top of the pitch. And here you see him muttering snatches from his favourite poet Yeats before setting off to lead the third pitch himself.
The third pitch is considerably easier. It consists in a corner with a crack in it which may be climbed by a layback, and then using some holes in the edge. Far more impressive than this climbing is the spillican, which forms the magnificent background to this shot. The climb runs almost directly up to it, and then up over the rather fearsome-looking overhangs above. This is Spillican Ridge, a child of Peter's optimism, and undoubtedly the hardest in the country. The upper part of this Prelude pitch is a groove climbed by a series of long but quite easy mantle shelves. it leads, after a certain amount of difficulty with the tree, to the stance at the Holly Tree of Holly Tree Shunt. From here one may take several finishes, either up Nightmare, which you see, or up Holly Tree Shunt itself, which is rather easier. Sean now follows up the crack and shows in each section of it that there are at least two right ways of doing everything. The little tree can be a useful hold. He confidently, one might even say ostentatiously, lays back up the final section instead of making the easier moves out on the right. Although this climb is only graded as very difficult, the first pitch is very strenuous with two quite difficult sections. Now you see Noel Masterson tackling the first difficult bit. The crack is rather constricted at the bottom, so that he has to reach rather high up with one foot and get it in the crack above the constriction. Then by a sort of layback movement, he pulls the rest of himself up. The crack above is mainly climbed by Jan boots, and hence is rather unusual in being easier in boots than rubbers. The crack ends against a large block, and to get around this the climber has to reach rather high up with the right hand. The right hand, Noel, to get a hold. Oh dear, he insists on using the left hand, and consequently gets in a certain amount of difficulty. The right hand, Noel. Ah, he's heard me at last. He's got the left hand up, and then kicking himself clear of the crack, he dangles for a moment, and using boots, knees, everything, pulls himself up until he can get the left hand up too, and then holds himself up to the stance, rather exhausted if he's human at all.
Well, at last Noel gets to the top and belays himself, getting ready to bring up his second man, Noel Brown. I think I should explain that this isn't the famous doctor and politician. Our Noel gets his name in the papers for other reasons, such as climbing Mont Blanc. Far down below, Tom Cullen ties on, ready for his turn, but unfortunately we don't see him climbing.
Noel Brown now takes over the lead and moves left from the stance and does a few fairly delicate and strenuous moves up in very steep rock. The use of the knee doesn't really make it any easier. I think he just does it from inverted snobbery. This bit is quite exposed, so not perhaps as exposed as you might think from this viewpoint. Rather easier moves follow up to the top, and you can see Noel doing them very smoothly.
Now we come to a climb called Expectancy.
The first few moves are quite easy and so need not occupy the climber's whole attention. The crux of the climb is a couple of moves up the groove on very small wrinkles, which, however, Betty supplements with a small hold in the face, and makes the section look quite deceptively easy. As you now see, even mantle shelves can be made to look graceful. This is followed by open face climbing and small toe holds, with finger holds which are useful for balance only. If either foot slipped, they would not be adequate to stop a fairly nasty fall. Betty has done that with characteristic smoothness. Holds are better from here on, fortunately so, for one just begins to notice one's distance from the ground. Section, Betty takes the purest finish straight up, instead of moving a couple of feet to the right to the white patch, where it's considerably easier.
Well, Betty reaches the top and pulls in the rope, ready to take up my 11-year-old daughter, Susan. This was the first time Susan had been on any of these climbs in Camaraderie, and indeed it was one of her very first climbs altogether.
Susan seems to be fairly nonplussed at first by the apparent lack of holes in the groove, but soon finds them. Like most climbers, she does not use the little hold out on the left, which Betty used. Again showing that there are two right ways of doing everything. Again, another way of making the mantle shelf movement, which is very smooth. Now she's moving onto the toe hold section. The left toe hold she's using there is sloping, and when it's wet it can be very hard to feel confident about it, especially as the finger holds at that place are rather inadequate. That's been very smooth and confident movement indeed, considering that she's done very little climbing up to the time this climb was done.
Well, Nuala Carey follows next, and as you see, she's wiping her rubbers dry on the rock before commencing. She has, of course, no difficulty in climbing Expectancy, especially as she led it herself the previous week. Unfortunately, my film ran out before she came to the interesting bit. However, she reached the top all right, and so ended a very pleasant day in Camaraderie.